Good morning, everyone. Welcome. We are here today to talk about music in global America. So this is effectively the introduction to our course and setting the stage for the musics that we will cover throughout the semester. We are going to start with my lecture notes. And because this is probably the first lecture that you're watching of mine, even though I've recorded them slightly out of order, um, I prepare a one-page lecture sheet that more or less should look like the blackboard or whiteboard when we are done with a particular class. So these are my notes, and you're welcome to use them and encouraged to use them and reference them, especially when studying for the quizzes and considering the other assessments for the class. But rather than talking about them in the abstract, here they are. This gives you an idea as to where we're headed. Most of the lectures, in fact, all of them are done in 4 parts with the exception of this first one, which is just done in 3 parts. The first part of this set is, of course, the way the class is set up for this particular semester that you're taking this class. However, we're going to drop right into our introduction on music in global America. Let me zoom in here. Our trajectory for part 1 is we're going to focus on this upper bit here and then travel down the right-hand side of the page, thinking a little bit about the history of the United States and how and what forces or considerations are going to be impacting music. So music of the United States reflects the country's really diverse population. And it's very clear that it's a diverse population because of the multitude of genres of music that we have. The mixture of music that we have is influenced by European countries, West Africa, Latin America, Asian countries, and the country's most internationally renowned genres include some of the things that I've listed below. And those are only like some of the larger genres, such as jazz, which is considered an original United States export, as is blues, country music, bluegrass, rock, rock and roll, R&B, pop, hip hop. We're going to spend a whole bunch of time this semester talking about hip hop and rap, soul, funk, disco. Going sort of backwards in time, there's also folk music and ragtime that are very specific to the United States, as is doo-wop. So, you know, while I've, in our third part, we're going to discuss, second part, the next part, the genres in a little bit more detail. Those are only some of them. And like I said, the larger labels. And that each of these genres has a massive following at this point as well. American music is heard throughout the world and has been since the 20th century, really, if not considerably earlier, but certainly in the last 100 years, due to we're going to see that technology has a major impact on what is happening with music. Moving to our, right-hand side of our page, we have some sort of historical considerations. Regarding this class specifically, the territory that is the United States was, of course, occupied initially by Native Americans, and they are the earliest inhabitants of the land and therefore are known as the first musical, existences of the US. However, we're not going to start our discussion there. the colonists, when they came over, did not set forth in trying to admire any of Native American culture or try to borrow any of it in their, specifically in their music or otherwise. So there's a major divide in terms of the U.S. So we're going to talk about the U.S. proper rather than the U.S. territory. But beginning in the 17th century, immigrants from the United Kingdom, Spain, Germany, and France began arriving in large numbers and brought with them, of course, the musical instruments and styles of music that were native to their home territories. Likewise, slaves from West Africa also brought their music traditions, and subsequent waves of immigrants continued to add to the very diverse melting pot that was the United States cultural scene. So, you know, what we're going to be studying in this class is really how waves of immigration end up transplanting musical ideas and how those ideas are evolved, developed, manipulated into other genres of music that we see and hear present today, or have gone out of style. But there's a really due to the migration of individuals to the United States, that's going to be the thing that has probably the most impact on the fabric of what's happening with music and culture in the United States, alongside the rise of technology, which is just going to spread the, you know, the fingers of and reach of what we are doing culturally to export and import from other locations. But we have a while to get there. Even our first wave of initial immigrants, what I love is that if there is anything to really admire about our problematic history, it is that some of our first music was indeed protest music. It was music that was, you know, inspired by and meant to continue the feelings of revolution. And not only the American Revolution, but later the Civil War were huge in setting forth advancements and developments in music, in particular. The Civil War especially, and the period afterwards, we saw a huge general flowering of American art, literature, and music. Music ensembles at this time were actually being formed, and can kind of be seen as the onset of popular music. And during this period, we start hearing and seeing the roots of gospel, jazz, and country music, which ended up really taking shape post-Civil War. By the mid-19th century, and a distinctly African-American folk tradition was widespread, and that really became the basis of our genre of spirituals, our fascination with minstrel shows, and the performance and dissemination of slave songs. And from those general genres and interests, we get new emergences from the music field, such as blues, the development of jazz, R&B, rock and roll, soul, and hip hop, which are really at this point consumed by a very, very diverse audience. Interestingly enough, country seems to really have a distinctly white audience, but we'll get to country as a genre in our next part. I have some really quite fascinating videos to share with you. The first thing that I want to do to give us a little bit of context is do a very quick survey of the early part of the late 1800s into the early 1900s. This is a survey of the music that was popular during a given year. So I want us to just kind of experience the change of attitude and direction in music that was popular, and perhaps how it was different than its European counterpart. Let me go ahead and pull up our video reel of of the last 100+ years greatest hits. Sorry, I misspoke. We're going to start in 1840, and we're going to get into probably around 1940. So we're going to try to travel 100 years. I'm going to stop intermittently and make some comments every 100 or so years, so we can get an idea as to what we're listening to, and maybe preempt some of the terminology that I'm going to outline in our next lecture.
Touched him in my cornfield.
Thou art sweeter day by day as I walk the narrow way.
Won't you get out the way, old Nantucket? You're too late to get your supper.
Oh, Susanna, oh, don't you cry for me.
Head to Lady Chain Cross, turn the opposite man.
There came town leaders sing this song, doo-da, doo-da. There came town race stacked by my long, oh-dee-doo-da day.
We sing one song for my old Kentucky home.
Oh, hard times come again no more.
John Brown's body lies moaning in the grave, but his truth still marches on.
When Johnny comes marching home again, hurrah, hurrah.
Beautiful dreamer, wake unto me.
All the boys are coming home, the boys are coming home, with banners torn and tattered, with columns worn and shattered.
All right, so let's consider what we've listened to so far. Lots of European imports. We heard some Mendelssohn being particularly in vogue, so we are not letting go of our European roots quite yet. Other than that, the music that we heard was very kind of folk-oriented. Aspects of it were particularly, some were more traditional and original imports by immigrants. Polka was mentioned very quickly. But we have music that was either A, meant to be danced to, B, meant to accompany some sort of religious service or worship, or we had three, secular music, which seemed to fit in one of two categories, which was either music of protest, which was politically oriented, or music that was sort of meant as a narrative storytelling device. So those are just some quick things that are, in the first, 40 or 20 or so years are a part of the musical landscape. The other thing that we heard is a number of things that we are still somewhat familiar with. And part of the reason is because they were passed down orally by performer to performer. A number of tunes that are also meant for collective performance or novice musicians. So that ends up being a consideration for music, especially in the United States, is the performability by all and not just particularly like professional musicians. It's not until like into the 1900s that we start making, it's not that like professional musicians didn't exist, that's not what I'm trying to say, but a lot of music that was particularly popular was popular because everyone could perform it and could participate in it. And part of that participation was also, music was used as a point of celebration, often paired along with dance. And that's how it would be typically consumed, particularly during this period. Let's watch a little bit more of this, trying to drag us into the turn of the century.
And the skies are not cloudy all day.
Carve that blossom, carve it to the heart.
Is the rose of Pilar, is the girl I love. Oh, them a golden slippers, oh, them a golden slippers.
I hold the dairy-o, the farmer in the dell.
Oh my darling, oh my darling, oh my darling Clementine.
Away in a manger, no crib for a bed. This sweet puppy went to market.
Oh, everybody thinks it's grand when they hear the circus band.
Of a bicycle built for two.
But the cat came back, he just couldn't stay away.
I love you as I never loved before.
Okay, so that brings us up to 1900. Some things that we're still hearing, lots of European imports. Why? So it's a good thing to remind ourselves of a little bit what's happening in Europe in the late 1800s. And in terms of music that's popular music is definitely opera in a lot of locations, has lots of memorable melodies, larger than life cast and plots. So we are going to hear a lot of like opera song imports, in addition to other instrumental music that was really popular in the late Romantic era. And that's what's happening, is like these big, rambunctious, larger than life, colorful orchestral pieces. And because the initial immigrants came from European countries, we're going to initially import a lot of interest in what's going on in Europe culturally before we have a stronghold in what's being developed in the United States. What we also heard are, again, continuations of songs of protest, and songs that are going to be heard within a more religious setting. So we heard some chorale settings of tunes that we're probably all familiar with, that have certainly long withstood the test of time. Interestingly, the emergences that we saw in the last little snippet were minstrel songs. We had a coon song in there. We're going to talk about the interest in minstrel performance and blackface later on in the semester, but we just saw it in this snippet. We also are going to, and we heard the beginnings of interest in ragtime, which is going to have a springing off point for jazz, although there are a number of other genres that intersect or sort of accumulate to the development of jazz. It's certainly not just ragtime. We also heard, as per our last segment, continuation of the folk music tradition, lots of old folk tunes that are, classic bits of Americana. Like in the first segment, we heard about Oh Susanna, which I certainly know that song. It's, again, a lot of tunes that have high singability, and therefore really invite novice musicians and performers to engage in the act of music making. I want to take us a little bit further to get us into the 1920s and 30s, where we start to hear for sure the emergence of jazz.
You can go as far as you like with me in my merry Oldsmobile. You are my queen in Jericho.
Take me out to the ball game. Take me out with the crowd.
Going for the Caramel.
Let me call you sweetheart.
Gonna miss your big fat mama, your mama, some of these days.
When Irish hearts are happy, all the world seems bright and gay.
Good Annie boy, the pipes are calling.
It's a long, long way to Tipperary. My heart right there.
those years there are really, really quite exciting for music history. What we ended up hearing is a lot of rag, which is, again, part of the reason why also piano ended up being a particularly popular instrument is because we also have the development of the player piano during this point. The prevalence of sheet music being sold to people with pianos and player pianos that had short, memorable tunes to them. Again, we see a stronghold of the folk style. Most certainly less interest on what's happening in Europe and European art music, and much more attention on what's going to make the United States have a particular musical voice, be it a very, 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 very diverse one. Also, what we heard is strong immigrant influence, right? Especially from the Irish side of things. And cannot stress that enough, that the waves of immigration are going to have profound impacts on what happens within music as a whole and its development into very interesting subgenres. Starting out in the 1900s is one thing, but once we sort of get to the 1940s and 50s, it is though we have an exponential curve, a kind of explosion of different genres. I'm going to get to our genre talk as the entirety of our next part, but before I leave our discussion of just sort of some historical considerations and giving us some backdrop that leads us into the diversification of all of these genres into different subgenres starting in the 1920s, I want to pull on this theme that's really interesting to me, and that is that music in the US, a lot of it has been as a means of protest and kind of bridging our gap from, the American Revolution, Civil War to current day. There's an interesting Vox video that talks and speaks about the development of protest music in the United States, which I think is a nice way of closing off this section. So let me go ahead and pull it up.
Right now, American protest music sounds like this.
We don't believe you, because we the people.
But it wasn't always this way. While today's protest music serves the same purpose as music like this, the way it reaches audiences has fundamentally reshaped the genre time and time again. Early American protest songs like Yankee Doodle and John Brown's Body were pretty simple. The melodies came from songs people already knew.
John Brown's body lies moaning in the grave, but his truth still marches on.
The lyrics were repetitive and easy to remember, and that made it easier for the songs to spread through the oral tradition.
And that's something that we already heard in our sampling of music history, is this what I call the high singability factor. And that is the way that music is mainly going to be disseminated.
The rise of electrical sound recording in the 1920s changed the way music was created. It allowed artists to use complex tunes and lyrics. A famous example of that is Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit from 1939. It was a powerful take on lynchings in the South.
Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze.
People had a really strong response to the song. They either loved it or they hated it. It was almost completely banned on the radio, which meant that most Americans heard about it, if they heard about it at all, through word of mouth.
But its omission from the radio didn't take the song out of history.
From the poplar trees.
After World War II, protest music changed again when folk music became popular through the radio.
This land is your land, and this land is my land. From
California to the New York Island.
Woody Guthrie is probably one of the most famous folk music protest writers. One of his most famous songs is This Land Is Your Land, which he wrote as a protest song in response to this super popular song at the time called God Bless America.
Guthrie's music became popular with the working class and went on to inspire musicians like Bob Dylan.
The times they are changing.
But Dylan himself edged away from the suggestion that he was a protest movement leader.
I got nothing to say about these things I write. I mean, I just write them. I don't have to say anything about them. I don't write them for any reason. There's no great message. I mean, if you want to tell other people that, go ahead and tell them.
People turned to Dylan's music for its unifying message despite his reluctance to be a part of any sort of movement. But there were other artists who were less coy than him.
And everybody knows about Mississippi gone down.
Nina Simone wrote Mississippi Goddam in response to the 1963 murder of civil rights activist Medgar Evers in Mississippi, and she also sings about the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Alabama that same year.
Alabama's got me so upset.
The civil rights movement produced several notable pieces of protest music, but the late 1960s and early 70s also saw a lot of political unrest in the United States. So this is Marvin Gaye's 1971 hit, What's Going On?
Brother, 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 there's far too many of you dying.
It was a part of a famous wave of protest music that followed the Kent State Massacre when the National Guard opened fire and killed 4 unarmed students protesting the Vietnam War. As the war came to an end, protest songs in America refocused on issues of class. The shift coincided with the rise of VH1 and MTV in the 1980s, which gave artists a visual medium to express themselves. Hip-hop quickly gained notoriety, in part thanks to groups like Public Enemy and NWA. While hip-hop became a burgeoning space for political thought, a feminist punk rock movement also began to take shape.
The Riot Grrrl movement was led by all women bands, and it was early to mid-90s when all these women came together with a focus on making their music try to forward progressive agendas, and specifically feminist ones.
Our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts.
After 9/11, there was this huge pool of emotion and frustration that helped singers make some really good music, but the lack of a unifying political movement left a millennial protest song resurgence sort of dead in the water. But bands like Green Day gave a really good effort, and the title track of their 2004 album, American Idiot, took aim at the war in Iraq.
Don't wanna be an American idiot.
The election of Barack Obama in 2008 brought a different energy to protest music. With the first black president in the White House, musicians took up the empowerment song.
I'm fucked up, homie, you fucked up, but if God got us, then we gon' be alright. Nigga, we gon' be alright.
Kendrick Lamar's All Right became a rallying cry for Black Lives Matter toward the end of Obama's presidency.
We gon' be alright.
And in this era, social media became the biggest tool for sharing music. That change is even more evident in the face of Donald Trump's presidency. A good example of that is the song Quiet by Milk. The songwriter, Connie Lim, used the internet to recruit a choir for the song, which became an anthem at the Women's March.
The purpose of protest music is to bring a movement together. So as long as people continue to do that and continue to leverage these new tools that we have with social media and with the internet to make these songs that gather people together, protest music will continue.
And protest is going to be a continuing theme that we see in a number of genres that we cover throughout the semester. From honestly calypso to soca to hip hop and rap. We're also going to take a look at protest music of Riot Grrrl and those groups mentioned in the 1990s. So many of the folk music genre have been really ignited by the idea of protest. And protest music, like I said, has a long-standing history in the United States. In fact, conflict in general seems to be of some sort or another, seems to be a driving force for some of the developments of these musical genres and subgenres. Before we leave this section, I want to take a look at a little bit of the immigration movement that I was talking about, brings us up to our discussion in the between 1920s and 1940, where we started having the emergence of some of these major genres.
In 1850, the vast majority of newcomers were from Ireland and Germany. In the 1860s, the labor shortages during the Civil War created strong demand for immigrant labor. 1870 saw Mexico become the top country of origin in much of the Southwest, while British immigrants preferred the Rocky Mountain territories. The 1880 census showed that the Chinese were coming in large numbers. Many took dangerous jobs in the mines or on railroad building crews. For the next century, immigrants from Canada crossing the southern border would be the largest group settling in many of the northernmost American states. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act blocked the arrival of large numbers of Asian immigrants for much of the next century. Unfortunately, the overall microdata for the 1890 census were destroyed in a 1921 fire at the Department of Commerce. So fast forward to 1900, the turn of the century, when the territorial boundaries of the continental United States are settled. For the first time, Norwegians, Swedes, and Italians were the largest groups coming to the states of South Dakota, Minnesota, and Louisiana, respectively. 1910 shows us how quickly things can change, with large numbers of Russians and Italians arriving. The only state where Ireland was the top country of origin was tiny Delaware. With the American population exceeding 100 million in the 1920 census, there were equal numbers of German, Italian, and Russian-born immigrants. Many had fled Europe to escape the horrors of World War I. By 1930, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing and the country was growing rapidly from within, so the percentage of foreign-born fell. And for the first time since 1850, Mexico was the dominant country of origin for new arrivals to California. By 1940,
all right, and we'll stop at 1940. So it just gives you an idea as to, I love how the interactive graph is really showing us how region by region things are shifting so very radically. And this is doubly true of any of the major metropolitan areas, most certainly, where we have probably the most change in population, certainly within New York specifically. In any case, I'm going to conclude our part one. Part two, we're going to talk about these different genres, exploring some of them and talking about their interconnectivity. And in our third and final part, we'll talk a little bit about globally what changes in technology and advancements in technology, how they impact music and the development of music in the United States.